Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at another video from Epic History TV. This one is about the 1848 revolutions, an event that has been forgotten largely in the consciousness of us Europeans, but nonetheless is very important for shaping future events later on in the 19th century. So without further ado, let's get going.
1848. More than 3 decades after his defeat, the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte and the French Revolution still looms over Europe.
Oh yeah.
The peace settlement of 1815 had been a triumph for reactionary forces.
Indeed. And this is one of the main criticisms that is usually levied by historians and contemporaries against the Congress of Vienna. It is that they ignored all of these national and liberal impulses stirred up by the French Revolution and then spread through the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. Effectively, these conservative reactionary forces have tried to turn back tide and reinstate the old conservative order where the powers and privileges of the old monarchies are preserved and strengthened. As they will see during 1848, this new forcibly imposed order can only last so long.
Europe's great powers, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, were committed to working together to ensure no more revolutions. Radicalism and republicanism would not be allowed to disturb the peace of Europe again.
Oh, how wrong they would be.
Austrian Chancellor Prince Clemens von Metternich is regarded as the architect of this new conservative order. Some historians call it the Metternich system.
Metternich we've discussed at length during the Congress of Vienna reactions by Historia Civilis, so you can go and check those out if you want. But yeah, it's worth reiterating that Prince Metternich is indeed, during the first half of the 19th century, the most brilliant diplomat and statesman there is, alongside other greats such as Talleyrand and Viscount Castlereagh. And he has masterminded this new conservative order, and he did a pretty good job, to keep a lid on things for this long, because it's been like 30 years, 3 decades, as they said, since Napoleon abdicated. But, as we will see, it is not going to end well for Metternich.
And yet, across Europe, there are many for whom the ideals of the French Revolution remain not a nightmare, but an inspiration. Liberals seek personal freedoms and civil rights, such as equality before the law, protected by constitutions, a free press, and regular elections. Nationalists share these aims with a desire in Italy and Germany for national unification, or in the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire for greater recognition, autonomy, and respect for language.
Yes, and as we will see, the 1848 revolutions is not a coherent movement. There are many driving forces behind it that resulted in these revolutions. Of course, liberals and nationalists are the main driving forces, but interspersed alongside those are groups like socialists, for example, and there are even aristocracy and nobility that has grown tired of the near absolutist or full absolutist powers of these old monarchies rather. So yeah, it's you can't really pinpoint to one movement, one group, and say this group is responsible for the 1848 revolutions. As we will probably see, it's very complicated.
Poles continue to seek the restoration of an independent Poland.
When haven't
and have
they?
launched one bloody uprising against the Russians in 1830. Their cause is supported by liberals across Europe. In most countries, liberals and nationalists face draconian censorship laws, arrest by the secret police, and bans on political parties and meetings. But there are always loopholes. In France, private banquets turn into political rallies. In Italy, scientific societies discuss politics, while gymnastic groups do the same in Germany. These liberal movements are dominated by the middle class, with their own local and national agendas, but also many shared values and aims. They are passionate, organized, and waiting for their opportunity.
Yes. So besides liberals and nationalists and socialists, you also got classes, various classes of society, predominantly dominated by the middle class, but also the working class is going to prove very important in order for these revolutions to happen. So yeah, it's really a society-wide movement, you could say, towards reform. Everyone wants reform of some kind, but they don't agree on how that reform should look. They just agree that the old order is not working for them anymore. Or has it ever even worked? I believe that right now we are sleeping on a volcano. Can you not sense that the earth is trembling again in Europe? Can you not feel the wind of revolution in the air? Alexis de Tocqueville. Yes, Alexis de Tocqueville is a very important figure in the certain fields, especially sociology and political science. He did a few works that he published that analyzed the living standards and social conditions of individuals living in Western societies. And he also was active politician during the Second Republic, where he continued to push for a modernization and centralization of France, as had happened during the Revolution, as well as a parliamentary government. Unfortunately for de Tocqueville, his wishes will, not really come to fruition in all respects. Certain monarchy is going to be re-established, but that is for later on.
But it isn't just the middle classes that want change. By 1848, rising populations and food prices had created hunger, poverty, and social unrest across Europe. Low wages and hunger drive peasants to cities in increasing numbers, where they become cheap labor to feed the growing pace of industrialization. They live in slums and work long hours in dreadful conditions.
Indeed. Industrialization is, of course, like automation in our own times, is ensuring that the old manual labor jobs are gradually but surely disappearing. And this is going to force a lot of people from the rural countryside into the cities to find jobs in factories. And there they often work under very dreadful conditions, maybe 12 to 15 hours a day, and then they live in slums and they have to spend half of their income on food. And so this is really the major downside with the Industrial Revolution, that so many people are being forced to leave. You didn't become rich on any of those manual labor jobs, but you could have a decent standard of living for the time. And now they can't even have that anymore. And this will, of course, increase social tensions within society. and it's eventually going to become a powder keg just waiting to be lit and explode.
If they can find work. Violent protests by workers and peasants are on the rise. Harvest failures and potato blight make a bad situation worse, with a deadly famine in Ireland and food riots across France.
The famine in Ireland is such a dreadful story, and it needn't have been so bad as it was. Millions of people either died or emigrated, primarily to America. And it was so bad that Ireland has still not recovered in terms of raw population numbers to this day. And it needn't have been that way, but because of the way that the British government handled the situation, treating Ireland with, well, as another colony in their vast empire, Ireland did not receive the assistance it needed and it could have gotten. So it's very unfortunate. But of course, this potato blight occurred in other European countries, and as such, situations weren't rosy for them either. But in Ireland, it especially was really, really bad.
In the face of such crises, Europe's governments offer little support or hope of reform. When French Prime Minister François Guizot is challenged that only the richest 0.5% could vote in France, he merely replies, "Enrichissez-vous, get rich."
Yeah, I think we'll come back to Guizot soon, but he is, how should I say it? He is the one driving a more conservative policy under King Louis Philippe, and he's extremely unpopular among the French.
In the winter of 1847-48, a sharp economic downturn throws thousands more out of work. The case for reform is more urgent than ever, but Europe's governments fail to act. The stage is set for a European revolution.
No state in Europe is in worse condition than ours. In the country which is said to be the garden of Europe, the people die of hunger and live worse than beasts. The only law is caprice. Luigi Settembrini, Neapolitan liberal, 1847.
In southern Italy, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies is ruled by Spanish Bourbon King Ferdinand II.
Yes, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies has existed in various forms ever since the Middle Ages, really, since 1200s. And two cadet branches of the Bourbon royal family has ruled Naples and Sicily since 1734. And there was a brief interruption, of course, when Napoleon annexed Naples and turned it into the Kingdom of Naples, in which first his brother Joseph Bonaparte ruled, and then his marshal Joachim Murat. And after the Napoleonic Wars, Murat was deposed, and absolutist rule was returned in the form of Ferdinand I, Ferdinand II's grandfather. And his return caused a return of absolutist rule, of course. And that resulted in a very serious liberal revolution in 1820. And of course, this could not be tolerated by Metternich's Congress system. And as such, there was a protocol signed, the Troppau Protocol of 1820. And the next year, there was the Congress of Laibach, where it was basically decided that absolutist rule, Ferdinand I would be put back on his throne, or well, he wasn't deposed really, but he would be returned in full force with the assistance of an Austrian army. And so, yeah, this effectively crushed this liberal revolution.
His disastrous agrarian reforms have united Sicilian landowners and peasants against him. His kingdom will witness 1848's first revolution.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, when Austrian troops entered and restored order, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies basically became a vassal state of Austria. And of course, now we have Ferdinand II, who ascended to the throne in 1830. And initially, he actually showed some, eagerness for reform and good governance, but gradually slipped into authoritarianism. And by 1848, he is ruling as an absolute monarch again. And he was now, due to these disastrous agrarian policies, among other things, forced into granting a constitution. And this will really set off the powder keg that is Europe at this time.
In Sicily, furious crowds chase Bourbon troops out of Palermo, and the island declares independence, readopting its liberal constitution of 1812.
Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, Sicily had been effectively independent because, of course, due to the British naval dominance, France could not send troops over to Sicily.
Revolutionary fervor spreads to the mainland. Mass rallies in Naples force King Ferdinand to issue his own constitution. In Piedmont, Sardinia, the threat of revolution persuades King Carlo Alberto to grant a constitution.
Carlo Alberto of Piedmont, Sardinia is a conservative at heart. He supports the divine rights of kings, and he has supported various legitimist movements across Europe before the revolutions happened. However, he is a eager reformer, and his reforms help, accelerate the social and economic development of the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. And he, among other things, introduces a new law code and liberalizes commerce, among other things. Carlo Alberto is pretty interesting. He believes in a neo-Guelph ideology, or ideal maybe, is a better word. And neo-Guelphism really is about uniting all of Italy under the leadership of the Pope, of all people. And of course, Pope at this time is a temporal ruler as well as a spiritual one. And when Pope Pius IX gets elected in 1846, he becomes a more liberal sovereign, and he is going to be very intent on liberating Italy from Austrian rule, which, if you remember from my Congress of Vienna reaction, was instituted in 1815. Now, in 1848, he was, well, I wouldn't say forced, but he was encouraged to issue his own constitution because of what happened in the Two Sicilies, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. However, it was quite a conservative constitution in that he retained full executive power and full command of the armies. But that's a little bit background on Carlo Alberto, important figure in this story.
And there are celebrations in the streets of Turin. Across the border in Austrian-ruled Lombardy, Venetia, Italian nationalists revolt in Milan and Venice and drive out the Austrian garrisons. But as dramatic as these events are, they're about to be eclipsed by news from Paris.
As usual, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. Prince Clemens von Metternich. What a great quote. So true.
Since France's 1830 July Revolution, the country has been ruled by Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king.
Yes, the July Revolution of 1830 is provoked by the very extremely reactionary rule of Charles X, who was supported by the ultra-royalists at the French court. Now, Charles X had no desire to rule as a constitutional monarch, which his brother had done. Louis XVIII had ruled under the Charter of 1814, which was basically a big compromise where most of the revolutionary reforms were kept in place, and the king ruled as a constitutional monarch. He shared power, and so on. Charles X did not want any of that. He wanted to go back to the days before the revolution, and he tried to increase this absolutist style of rule by increasing the power of the Catholic Church. He then, during July 1830, issued a number of really brazen reforms, whereby he limited the franchise to a tiny speck of the population. He reimposed the full press censorship. He disbanded the Chamber of the Deputies, the lower house, the French parliament at this time. And really, it was a disaster because this provoked urban revolts in Paris, and Charles X was forced to abdicate, run away. Now, King Louis Philippe here is going to succeed him. He is from the House of Orléans, which is a cadet branch of the House of Bourbon. And he had a reputation as a more liberal and popular figure in France. And he chose to style himself as King of the French. That's his actual title, not King of France. King of the French, in order to link his rule closer to the people, as a true populist would do. And Louis Philippe is, at the time of his accession, one of the wealthiest men in France. He has been a successful businessman so far, and he will continue to be linked closely to business. Now, he rules in a pretty unpretentious fashion. He avoids the lavish pomp and spending that his predecessors are famous for. But despite this outward appearance of simplicity, he is actually, like I said, one of the wealthiest businessmen in France. He is deriving much of his support from the wealthy bourgeoisie. And he was at first beloved. He was known as the citizen king, but he became increasingly conservative and monarchical as time went on, and thus he became more unpopular. Now, in order to prop up his government, he needed something. He could not rely on dynastic connections. He is the first king of the French from his dynasty, so he didn't have any dynastic glories to rely on. And, he got his power through the people, basically, since the Chamber of Deputies are the ones who appointed him King of France. So, what does he do? Well, he turns to the glories of Napoleon, and he tries to rely on those to prop up his regime. He supports the return of Napoleon's remains from St. Helena. He completes the Arc de Triomphe, which Napoleon had ordered constructed, his victory monument in the center of Paris. And this does not really help. Now, Louis Philippe's rule is basically characterized by his favor of the land-owning financial aristocracy, bankers, and so on. And this elitism disenfranchised many middle and working class people in France, and this combined with a lack of appetite for further liberal reform and indifference to their needs and welfare will lead him to being overthrown here.
He's a more moderate figure than his Bourbon predecessor, Charles X, but he opposes further reform despite the growing economic crisis. His Prime Minister, François Guizot, is hated. When he bans the banquets that are really opposition rallies, angry crowds march through Paris, chanting, "Down with Guizot, long live reform." Guizot resigns, but it is not enough. Nervous troops fire on the crowds. 52 civilians are killed. Louis-Philippe loses control of the capital, and as the mob advances on the Tuileries Palace, he abdicates and flees to England. A new provisional government is formed, and from the Hôtel de Ville, new Foreign Minister Alphonse de Lamartine announces the Republic has been proclaimed. France's monarchy has fallen in just 3 days.
Now, of course, this is the Second Republic right now. When looking today, France is on its 5th Republic. And how do you know when we've gone over to another republic? Well, when a major constitutional change happens. That's basically when a new republic is proclaimed in France.
The news is carried across Europe by the new telegraph system.
Oh yeah, and it's ironic because Charles X was also overthrown in 3 days. Louis-Philippe also overthrown in 3 days. Both went into exile in England. It seems to be the sort of everyone goes into exile. Metternich will go into exile in England and so on. I don't know what's so good about England. No, really, but it's pretty safe there, you know, all things considered. It's a constitutional monarchy and all that. In any case, that was a side tangent. Yeah, the telegraph system has been invented by now, and that means news can spread so much quicker than it could have before. This really changes everything, really, because these technological innovations means that this political consciousness that had only existed in cities like Paris and so on can now be spread across the country and across Europe in a matter of days, really. And this is really what will set off all of the rest of the revolutions of 1848.
The effect is electrifying.
Tell the people that I agree to everything. Ferdinand I, Emperor of Austria. That's a pretty funny quote.
75-year-old Austrian Chancellor Prince Metternich is among the first to be informed of the revolution in Paris. His police chief assures him there's no chance of such a thing happening in Vienna. But on the 13th of March, around 4,000 students, inspired by the news from Paris, march on the Landhaus, the assembly building, and force their way in. There's a confrontation with troops who open fire and kill 4. Vienna's workers side with the students. Much of the crowd's hostility is directed at Metternich. When the State Council suggests he resign, Metternich meekly agrees and heads into exile in England. One of the most extraordinary political careers in Europe's history, spanning 40 years, comes to an end.
And Metternich, of course, is the very symbol of repression in Austria and in Europe, really. And so it's no surprise that they sort of wanted him to go, and maybe the revolution will go with him, so to speak. Of course, they were really wrong about that. Once Metternich was gone, there was only more clamor for further reforms. And it's really cool, though, that we have a picture here of Metternich. And we're really coming into the age of photography now. And it's a shame we sort of missed the Napoleonic era. What a treat it would be to see, a photograph of Napoleon or anyone else during that era. But alas, we have to settle for this.
Emperor Ferdinand suffers from epilepsy and a speech impediment, and is a largely passive figure.
Yeah, Ferdinand is not fit to rule at all, and Francis I, who is his father, had willed it in his in his will. He said that Archduke Louis should basically run everything with the help of Metternich. And so now Metternich is gone, and he's sort of left without a really strong statesman at the helm. Ferdinand won't last for much longer on his throne, he will prove incapable of reacting to events properly.
But when his council announces there will be elections for an assembly that will draft a constitution, crowds cheer him in the street. The secret police disappear. Censorship is ignored. The people of Vienna celebrate. Nationalists within the Austrian Empire are also inspired by events. In the Hungarian parliament, politician Lajos Kossuth makes a fiery speech denouncing Habsburg absolutism as the pestilential air which dulls our nerves and paralyzes our spirit.
Yeah, so the revolutions that will occur within the Austrian Empire in 1848 are the product of mounting social and political tensions that followed the Congress of Vienna, and even before that. The already conservative Austria moved further and further away from Enlightenment ideals. There was further restrictions of the freedom of the press and association, and the conservative government is going to be completely taken off guard by these events. So, of course, Hungary is a special case. Hungary has been part of the Austrian Empire since 1526, when, at least half of it, of the original Kingdom of Hungary, was absorbed under Austria's domain. And there's a really complicated history there that we cannot get into here because we'll be here all day. But suffice to say, the relationship between the German-speaking core in Austria and Hungarians had always been very delicate. And this delicate balance has been completely disturbed by revolutions across Europe.
His speech is printed and circulated widely, inspiring others across the empire. Hungarians launched their own revolution, with 12 demands that include greater autonomy, a free press, and parliamentary reform. Czech liberals in Prague form a national committee and also send their demands to Vienna.
This is, of course, the problem unique for the Austrian Empire, of course, because the Austrian Empire is one of the most diverse empires in history. Really encompasses so many different ethnicities and languages, and it was not made for a world that embraced nationalism. And now everyone's going to want autonomy and independence, even in some cases, as we'll see later on.
There is even a Romanian nationalist uprising in the Ottoman province of Wallachia, forcing the abdication of the local prince.
We were dominated by a vague feeling, as if a great outbreak of elemental forces had begun, as if an earthquake was coming, of which we had felt the first shock. Karl Schurz, German student.
Across the smaller states of Germany, rulers face popular demands for reform. Most quickly grant concessions to avoid losing their thrones.
Yeah, so the smaller German states here in the German confederations are fearing a similar fate to that of Louis Philippe and the March Revolution in Vienna. And so these kingdoms, principalities, and duchies pretty much all grant constitutions in order to tamp down or preempt any revolutionary disturbance. And in addition to the usual demands for liberal reform, there was also these nationalists particularly stressed pan-Germanism, the idea that all of German-speaking people should be united into one state. And that is going to be the big issue, one of the big issues in 19th century Europe, the unification of Germany.
The black, red and gold tricolour, symbol of a united Germany, is prominent among the crowds.
Of course, it's the current German
Germany's first ever National Assembly meets in Frankfurt, with elected delegates from across Germany. They debate how they will achieve the liberal dream of a unified Germany and begin drafting its national constitution. In the Prussian capital, Berlin, Students and liberals are thrilled by developments and celebrate Metternich's fall. King Frederick William IV promises reform, but also moves extra troops into the city.
Frederick William IV is an interesting character, one of the most important ones especially for the whole German question. Frederick William IV, as many of the Prussian rulers before him, were staunchly conservative. However, he did not seek to be a despotic, absolute monarch, and so he toned down many of the reactionary policies that his father had instituted, Frederick William III, of course. And there are many Frederick Williams in Prussian history. I digress. In any case, he eased up on press censorship, and he also reconciled with the Catholic population of Prussia, which there had been tensions for a long time. He also promised to enact a constitution, but he did not he refused the very notion of a legislative assembly. So we'll see how that goes.
Tensions escalate between Berliners and soldiers, and on the 18th of March, protesters erect barricades. The army attacks, leading to vicious fighting in the streets. 800 protesters are killed. The king loses his stomach for the slaughter and withdraws troops from the city, promising a new constitution.
Yeah, so Frederick William initially moved to suppress the revolution by force. He realizes that he's not going to be able to do it without much slaughter, and he doesn't have the stomach for it. And instead, he decides to switch tactics. He decides to place himself at the head of this revolutionary movement by forming a liberal government, and he convenes a national assembly to draft a Prussian constitution. And he's going to do this and wait until the political situation becomes more advantageous to him, where he might be able to crush the revolution that way instead. Saddle your horses, gentlemen. A republic has been declared in France. Nicholas, Emperor of Russia. Oh yeah.
Not all Europe is embracing change. In Russia, Emperor Nicholas firmly opposes any reforms. He'd been badly shaken by the Decembrist revolt on the opening day of his reign.
The Decembrist revolt is something Epic History TV has covered. If you guys want to see me react to that, let me know. We'll get on to that right away.
Since then, he has tightened censorship and created a new secret police unit, the Third Department. There is a crackdown on all suspected subversives. Writer Fyodor Dostoevsky is among those arrested and subjected to a mock execution before he is exiled to Siberia.
Fyodor Dostoevsky is, of course, one of the greatest authors of all time. War and Peace, if I'm not completely thinking of the wrong person here, is his greatest work, of course. But yeah, there will be no reforms in Russia. And this Nicholas I is probably the most reactionary and conservative monarch in Europe at this time. And it is his military character is reflected in his government. He didn't have much of any civilians within his government. He relied solely on military men to carry out his will. He often bypassed regular channels and resented formal deliberations of matters. And so he reduced the roles of the ministers, the state council, and the Russian Senate. And this resulted, practically, for all intents and purposes, in a more absolutist reign than before, which is really astonishing, considering Alexander I was also quite an absolute monarch. And this had poor effects on the administration of the country. It was already cumbersome before Nicholas I took over after Alexander, but the administration of the empire became even more complicated and convoluted during Nicholas's reign. And of course, he also did, like they said, he established the Third Department. It's basically a political secret police. which he uses to control his population and punish any subversive or revolutionary elements. And all of this combined results in Russia not receiving the much needed basic reforms. It really needs it, because Russia is starting to fall behind the other European powers more and more, especially now with the Industrial Revolution going on.
There will be no concessions in Russia. By European standards, Britain is already a liberal constitutional monarchy, and the middle classes broadly accept the status quo. But there is a popular movement calling for more democratic reforms. They're known as the Chartists, for the 6-point charter they wish to implement.
Yeah, so Britain had been a constitutional monarchy for a long time now, actually. Ever since Charles I lost the Civil War, the English Civil War, Parliament has been the supreme authority in Britain, and those events happened in the mid-1600s. And after that, Parliament has gradually gained more and more power. And by this point, in the 19th century, the monarchy is quite weak. I believe we're already past the point where monarchs veto legislation. I believe Queen Anne was the last British monarch to veto any sort of legislation from Parliament. And so, yeah, by European standards, Britain is pretty far ahead here. But there are always those who want more reform, and the Chartist movement is one example of this. It is really one of the first really big working class movements we see in Europe. And the Chartist movement was created following the disappointment that came from the 1832 Reform Act in Britain, which extended the vote to more people, but it did not extend the vote beyond the property-owning classes. And as such, the Chartist movement was founded, soon attracting millions of followers, and they wanted to implement this charter. Most important point they wanted implemented, of course, was universal male suffrage. Votes for all men over 21. Although the Chartist movement really pushed hard for this, especially during 1848. They were not heard at the time, but eventually almost all of these points will be implemented by successive parliaments. The last point being implemented is the payment of MPs in 1911. And the only objective they didn't achieve here is annual parliaments. And now in Britain, parliaments last for 5 years, but the Prime Minister, of course, has the power to call an election early. So that is the only point they did not get. Not bad, though. And as I said, Britain was way ahead of the curve here.
A mass rally is organised for the 10th of April in London. This is a photograph of that meeting.
Really shows
the
you
authorities
the size of this
violence movement and draft in 80,000 extra police. But the event passes off peacefully.
Yeah, and not only are these demands that the Chartist movements are laying out would be considered almost extreme down on the continent, the event passes off peacefully, and this is a constitutionally legitimate movement. There is no violent overthrow or anything like that. So yeah, Britain is an odd case in 1848.
In the Netherlands, King William II backs a new constitution and reforms, successfully preempting any revolutionary disturbance. With fortuitous timing, Frederick VII of Denmark had abolished royal absolutism in January, so also avoids revolution. But he faces a German nationalist revolt in Schleswig-Holstein, which leads to war with the German Confederation. Denmark will ultimately prevail in this war thanks to diplomatic support from the other European powers.
Yeah, so the First Schleswig War really results over a dispute over the relationship of the duchies, the German duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, to the Danish crown and to the German Confederation, respectively. Although ostensibly the nature of this conflict is a clash between Danish and German nationalism, it's quickly developed into an international conflict that prompted foreign intervention. Now, what's really going on here is that the Danish crown wants to tie the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein closer to Denmark and start to incorporate them more and more into Denmark proper. And this is not accepted by the German minority in Schleswig and Holstein. And they get the backing of Prussia primarily and the whole of the German Confederation. But Britain and Russia primarily are the ones who are going to intervene on Denmark's side. And they have completely other concerns, really. Their main concern is that Prussia, a fellow great power, would gain control over the Danish Straits. And this would threaten Britain's access to the Baltic Sea and to the trade which comes from the Baltic. Russia, on the other hand, are worried that if Prussia gains control of the Danish Straits, they will not be able to use them to pass through it with the Imperial Russian Navy, the Russian Baltic Fleet. And thus, they intervene on the side of Denmark, and they confirmed Denmark's sovereignty over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, but they were to be separate entities and they were not to be absorbed into Denmark proper. That was the compromise that was struck, basically.
In 1848, Polish hopes were high that these revolutions would pave the way for the restoration of an independent Poland.
Look at that. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at its height, that's what's being shown here. Really a gargantuan state when you look at it this way. And yeah, any hopes of getting Poland back in any form is pretty much doomed. Now, on the map, it says Kingdom of Poland. This is what is known as Congress Poland. It is technically and formally a separate entity from the Russian Empire, but it is ruled by the Russian Tsar, Nicholas, at this point. And he and Alexander I, his predecessor, did not really respect the limitations that were put on their power as rulers of the Kingdom of Poland. And it is, for all intents and purposes, a part of Russia at this point. It only exists on a map.
Europe's liberals, after all, had frequently expressed enthusiasm for the idea.
They had.
But in reality, no major power is willing to risk confrontation with Russia for the sake of the Poles.
And especially not now, when Prussia and Austria primarily are experiencing revolutionary disturbance.
A Polish rising in Posen is put down by the Prussians, while the Austrians deal with risings in Krakow and Galicia.
The February Revolution was like a sacred promise of emancipation for all of the people of Europe. Mark
The first euphoric phase of the European revolutions becomes known as the springtime of the peoples. With censorship relaxed, there's an explosion in the number of newspapers, among them Cologne's radical new daily, Neue Rheinische Zeitung, edited by Karl Marx.
Now, Karl Marx is a name everyone should know, and if you don't know it, I don't know what you're doing here. Karl Marx is probably, one could easily say that Karl Marx is the most influential figure of the 19th century. If, at the very least, he's one of the most influential figures. One could even consider Marx to be one of the most influential people in human history. I would actually go as far as to say that. because his work is critical in exerting influence on modern intellectual, economic, and political history. Through his various works, most famously the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848, and Das Kapital, Marx lays out his ideas and program for a revolution, really. He has a theory that says that human societies throughout history have always developed through class conflict. Now, he posits that the conflict is between a ruling class, known as the bourgeoisie, and a proletariat, the working class, who sell their labor power in exchange for wages. Now, he theorizes that capitalism, like previous socioeconomic systems throughout history, will eventually produce internal tensions that will lead the working class to develop a class consciousness, if you want. And eventually, this will lead to their conquest of political power, and they will establish a classless communist society. Marx actively pressed for this interpretation, and he argued that the proletariat should take revolutionary action to topple capitalism and bring about socioeconomic emancipation, as he called it. Now, Marx's thoughts and ideas have inspired a number of theoretical variants that you may have heard of, such as Leninism, Maoism, Marxism, Leninism, so on and so forth. And these ideologies, theoretical variants, whatever you want to call them, were used in 20th century socialist states. Famously, we have the Soviet Union, and of course today we still have the People's Republic of China, who ostensibly is still a communist country, although that to what extent can be argued at this point. But still, Marx is a really important figure, and someone everyone should know about.
It feels like the dawn of a new era. But these early successes are built on the back of an uneasy alliance, as Marx is quick to highlight. Middle-class liberals want constitutions, more inclusion in politics, and a free press. Workers, who are the revolutionary foot soldiers in many cities, want cheaper food and the right to work. German radicals sum it up with a neat pun: freedom to read versus freedom to feed.
And it is this split in objectives that will contribute to the doom of all of these revolutions. Because when revolutionaries start fighting each other, the monarchies will be able to exploit that division, move in, re-establish the old order.
Europe's new assemblies are under pressure from conservatives who think they're going too far, and radicals and socialists who think they're not going far enough. Most horrifying of all to Europe's middle class, there hovers the threat of mass, direct action, social revolution, the mob.
Red or lead. Red or lead. Rallying cry of Paris workers, June 1848.
In the wake of the revolution, France's provisional government had set up national workshops, a public works program to alleviate unemployment in Paris. But just 3 months later, a new, more conservative government announces their closure. 100,000 workers are suddenly jobless.
Now, these national workshops were basically government-funded jobs, and they could be in various sectors. Construction, for example, a public works program, really an old-styled Roman works program is what these national workshops really were. And of course, it's fine and dandy as long as the government is paying the wages for this, and it, might stimulate the growth and all that. But it's a pretty expensive program, one can imagine at least. And so I could see how a conservative government might, or a conservative government will close them down.
The response is immediate and furious.
I bet.
Over 3 days in June, Paris radicals take on the middle-class National Guard and regular troops in a bloody battle of the barricades. the Archbishop of Paris attempts to mediate, but is cut down in a crossfire. This remarkable early photograph shows some of the Paris barricades fought over that summer.
And, you know, you may look at this picture if you've been in Paris, and, you know, Paris doesn't look like this anymore. So, yeah, that's because Napoleon III, a figure we will talk about later, will come in and basically redo all of Paris and rebuild it from the ground up. But anyways, that's another side tangent. But this is a really cool picture. Really brings you... when you have photos like this, it really brings you closer to the events. You can really imagine how people ripped tiles from the roads and piled them up, and logs and all that to build barricades. Really quite a story.
By the time it's all over, General Cavaignac's troops have killed at least 1,500 workers and arrest 12,000 more, a third of whom are deported to Algeria. He believes he has saved France from anarchy. The sacred cause of the Republic has triumphed, he declares.
Yeah.
The French Revolution has split between left and right, with bloody consequences. It paves the way for the return of a famous name from the past, promising unity and order.
3 days of blood will give us 30 years of peace. Joseph Radetzky von Radetz, Austrian Field Marshal. That's quite a quote, and I mean, he's not entirely wrong, actually.
That spring, conservative governments had been caught off guard by the speed of events. Now they begin to fight back. In Prague, Czech students clash with troops. The wife of Austrian commander General Windisch-Graetz is killed by a stray bullet.
Windisch-Graetz is a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. He particularly distinguished himself at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. And that's the case with many of these Austrian generals and field marshals at this point. Most of them came up during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars.
He responds by withdrawing his troops and bombarding the city's old town with artillery. 43 are killed before the students surrender.
Yeah.
In Italy, King Carlo Alberto of Piedmont, Sardinia, has declared an Italian war of liberation against Austria and invades Lombardy, Venetia. He is supported by the other Italian states and nationalist volunteers, including the Italian Legion, led by professional revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Now, when he says professional revolutionary, he is not kidding. Giuseppe Garibaldi is today considered one of the 4 founding fathers of Italy. He was crucial in leading the military arm of the Italian nationalist revolutionary movement. What can we say about him during his early part of his life? He lived as a fisherman and sailor. And during this time, he came under the influence of Giuseppe Mazzini, who is really the great prophet of Italian nationalism. His ideas were very influential on the whole nationalist movement. In any case, after taking part in a failed mutiny to provoke a Piedmontese Republican Revolution, he fled and lived in exile in South America from 1836 until this year, 1848. And during this time, he fought with revolutionaries against the Brazilian Empire in South America, and those experiences over there really gave him invaluable training in the techniques of guerrilla warfare that he would later use to great effect against French and Austrian armies. And it's really these exploits that made him a professional revolutionary, because he was always acting as if life was a perpetual struggle for liberty. And of course, in 1848, he returned to fight Austria and try to unite Italy now.
Austrian forces in Italy are commanded by 81-year-old Field Marshal Radetzky, a distinguished veteran of the Napoleonic Wars.
Radetzky really is distinguished. He fought against Napoleon during the 1796 Italian campaign. He fought at the Battle of Marengo, again against Napoleon, the Battle of Eckmühl, the Battle of Wagram, to mention a few battles where he fought against Napoleon directly, actually. In 1813, he served as Prince Schwarzenberg's chief of staff and was heavily involved in the planning of the German campaign. Again, he fought Napoleon in 1814 during the Battle of Brienne and Arcis-sur-Aube, and he entered Paris together with the Allied monarchs there. Then he returned with them at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Now, if you recall from my Congress of Vienna reaction, Metternich and Alexander I didn't actually get along that well. And it appears that Radetzky was the one who acted as a sort of intermediary between those two so they could still negotiate. And in 1836, he has reached the rank of Field Marshal, and he has going to prove himself still capable despite his advanced age at this point.
Vienna orders him to negotiate. Instead, Radetzky wages a masterful campaign, fending off the Piedmontese advance, then launching a decisive counterattack. Piedmontese forces retreat in disarray, and Carlo Alberto negotiates a truce. That summer, Johann Strauss composes the Radetzky March to celebrate the old general's victory.
It's his most famous work. Really great march.
Meanwhile, Austrian relations with Hungary are in crisis. The country is now effectively independent, with its own elected parliament and a prime minister, Lajos Batthyány. But
the Austrian Empire is in a weak condition even before 1848, and as such, during the initial phase of the revolution, the central government of in Vienna was not really in a position to do anything about these movements and such. And so they were forced to grant both autonomy and political concessions, especially so to Hungary. But the Austrian central government has no intention of keeping those promises, really, of autonomy.
not everyone wants to be part of the new Hungary. Savage ethnic conflicts break out between Hungarians and Romanians in Transylvania and Hungarians and Serbs in Vojvodina.
And this is another problem with the Kingdom of Hungary itself. It is much bigger than modern Hungary, of course, but still. It incorporates many more non-Hungarians than Hungarians even. That's how big Hungary is. And so these Hungarian nationalists, of course, want to ensure that, the Hungarian national identity and language is being used in all of the Kingdom of Hungary. But these ethnic minorities within the kingdom don't want to be a part of that. Well, that's going to lead to conflict. And savage ethnic conflicts is, of course, a recurring theme in Balkan history. And this is not the last time we will have to discuss that.
Leaving thousands dead. An even greater threat is Croatian General Josip Jelačić, a fire-breathing imperial loyalist who takes matters into his own hands and invades what he regards as a renegade province.
Now, Jelačić really keeps a firm iron grasp of Croatia, and he ensures that the Croatians and the Slovaks and the Serbs don't join in on this Hungarian revolution. And now he's going to take matters into his own hand and crush the revolution.
The emperor still hopes for a peaceful resolution and sends a loyal general, Count Lamberg, to take command of Hungarian military forces. But on arrival, he's brutally murdered by a mob. Appalled, the imperial government declares war on the Hungarian revolutionaries. This in turn outrages liberals and radicals in Vienna. There is fresh violence on the streets, and the Austrian Minister of War is lynched. Troops evacuate the city, while the emperor flees to Olmütz. Jelačić marches to the government's aid. He joins forces with Windisch Graetz outside Vienna, and together they bombard the city. Then they attack. The October Rising is crushed, with the loss of 2,000 lives.
Yeah, now you're starting to see that the central government has mobilized loyal government troops, and now they will move swiftly to forcibly crush these revolutions. And the concessions they've granted so far was only to win time to mobilize their strength.
25 revolutionary leaders are executed, including Robert Blum, a member of the German parliament in Frankfurt. He becomes a celebrated martyr of the revolutions. With Vienna secure, the Austrian invasion of Hungary can begin. The Hungarians are heavily outnumbered. Budapest falls, and the Hungarian government evacuates to Debrecen.
We now have 40,000 men in and around Berlin. Order in Berlin, and we shall have order in the country. Major Helmut von Moltke. Ah yes, Helmut von Moltke the Elder is the man who will become the celebrated chief of staff of the Prussian and later German Imperial Army. And he retained that position for 30 years. He is really regarded as the creator of a new, more modern method of directing armies in the field, and one of the finest military minds of his generation, really. He commanded troops in both Europe and the Middle East, and during the Second Schleswig War, the Austro-Prussian War, and of course, finally, the Franco-Prussian War. And he really, for lack of a better word, embodies the Prussian military organization and tactical genius. So Moltke is a figure we will have to discuss at some later point, but he's not quite as relevant in 1848, only having the rank of major.
Following the violence in Berlin that March, the King of Prussia withdraws to his palace at Potsdam on the outskirts of the city. Here he is surrounded by loyal troops and conservative advisors, including a 33-year-old aristocrat named Otto von Bismarck.
Ah yes. Now, if Metternich is the most brilliant statesman and diplomat of the first half of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck is the most brilliant of the second half of the 19th century. Still today, widely regarded as one of the most brilliant and successful diplomats and statesmen, not only of the 19th century, but of all time. He is really the mastermind behind German unification later on, spoiler alert. And he was responsible for the creation of the first modern welfare state in Germany. And using his diplomatic skill, he created and juggled a very complex system of interlocking conferences, negotiations, alliances, and this eventually resulted in both the creation and the maintenance of the German Empire. What makes Bismarck special is that he possessed both an exceptional long-term national and international vision for Prussia and later Germany, but also an extraordinary short-term ability to handle complex developments both at home and abroad. And he This really made him a hero to German nationalists. Of course, he has also been criticized because of these policies led to strengthening of nationalist sentiments, which would come to haunt Germany in World War One. You can have your opinion on that. Fact remains is Bismarck is going to become one of the people who will achieve the dream of unifying Germany.
When asked for his view on what should be done, Bismarck says nothing, but leans over to a piano and taps out the March of the Prussian Infantry.
That's a typical Bismarck thing to do. Bismarck is a very conservative, very royalist in his leanings. He does not believe in parliamentary government at all. He does not believe in constitutions. He believes in the divine right to rule, the divine right of kings. And despite that, he knows how to use the revolution and revolutionary methods to accomplish what he wants.
The forces of conservatism are strong in Prussia.
Very strong.
There is deep loyalty to the state and the king.
And this really ties into the whole Prussian militarism, where there is a little difference between the Prussian state and the Prussian army. And it's worth, again, repeating Voltaire's quote, whereas some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. And this all ties into the deep loyalty that is felt to the state and to the king, who is the state, really.
Allies, like Bismarck, adopt the enemy's tactics, launching conservative political organizations and newspapers to mobilize this support.
And that's what makes Bismarck really good. He used the enemy's tactics against them to mobilize support for his cause. And that is something that other European governments perhaps could have done instead of using such brute force methods. But of course, not everyone has the delicate diplomatic touch of Bismarck.
By November, King Frederick William has noted the infighting of his opponents and the defeat of the Vienna Revolution and decides to act. He orders General Wrangel to lead 13,000 troops into Berlin. They enter the city unopposed and order the Prussian assembly to disperse. It has no option but to comply. Prussia will get its constitution, but it is one handed down by the king, under which he retains full executive power.
Now, despite the fact that the 1848 Prussian constitution was handed down by Frederick William IV personally, significantly watered down compared to the drafts of the Prussian National Assembly, the fact that the constitution now existed at all was a major step forward for Prussian liberals. And there were some gains that were made in this constitution. The freedom of the press and assembly was guaranteed. Jury trials were introduced. And these were, among other things, of course, and these were key liberal concessions. But there was still the major problem that there were inadequate separation of powers and control of these powers in this constitution, which basically resulted in the monarchy retaining much of its previous powers.
Prussian dreams of a true parliamentary system, even a republic, are dashed. In December, two new players take the stage, who will play key roles in shaping the fate of Europe's revolutions. In Vienna, Emperor Ferdinand abdicates in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph.
Now, Franz Joseph is the nephew of Emperor Ferdinand, and he actually received his first baptism with Radetzky fighting in Italy. By all accounts, he handled that experience with calm and dignity. Now, at this point, Austria needs a new ruler for several reasons. One, um, a new ruler would not be bound by the constitutional concessions that Ferdinand had sworn an oath to uphold, and they also needed a young and energetic leadership at the top to, reform and to put down these revolutions. And so Ferdinand abdicated in favor of his nephew, Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph will initially pursue quite a cautious policy, and he granted a constitution in 1849 where he basically revoked all of the concessions made by Ferdinand in 1848. And he also carved up the Kingdom of Hungary into 5 military districts, and to break up the consolidation of power in the future. And he also re-established the Principality of Transylvania, again to take away power from the Kingdom of Hungary. And, Franz Joseph was ultimately able to re-establish control of the Austrian Empire, but I think we'll get that later in the video.
He will reign until his death in 1916.
Yes, Franz Joseph is really the last effective ruler of the Austrian Empire, and he is, of course, at the throne during the disaster which is World War I, and he has to preside over the Austrian Empire's disintegration and collapse, although he won't live to see the end of it.
In Paris, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Emperor Napoleon, is elected President of the French Republic in a landslide victory.
Oh yes, now there's much I could say about the Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, but I'll try to limit myself. He is born in 1808 to Louis Bonaparte, who was of course the King of Holland, and Hortense de Beauharnais, Empress Josephine's daughter. He was the first Bonaparte prince that was born after the proclamation of the empire. Now, following Napoleon's second abdication, all of the Bonapartes were forced into exile. Hortense and Louis Napoleon was exiled to Switzerland. There they lived until he was 15, where he moved to Rome. He would learn Italian during his stay in Italy, and he would also become involved in an Italian secret revolutionary society called the Carbonari, where he would fight against Austrian domination of Italy. So he's sort of involved in this Italian nationalist struggle. And of course, he was eventually found out, and these activities forced him to flee back to France. And they arrived there shortly after the July Revolution of 1830. And there he stayed briefly. And then he tried to launch a coup against King Louis Philippe in 1836. That failed, so he fled into exile into Switzerland. King Louis Philippe mobilized an army to invade Switzerland. Of course, Louis Napoleon did not want to expose Switzerland to this, so he fled and went into exile. Well, first he traveled a bit. New York, he was in America, he was in Brazil, in England, and eventually settled down in England. And then in 1840, he tried to do another coup against Louis Philippe, which failed even more miserably than the first one. And then he sat in prison in France for a while. He managed to escape back to England. And then, when the February Revolution of 1848 happens, he feels like it's his moment to shine, returns to France, quickly becomes very popular, on the basis that, he's related to the great Emperor Napoleon and the Bonaparte dynasty and all that comes with it. So he manages to get himself elected as a deputy, and then in a landslide victory, he gets elected President of the French Republic. And he decides to take the title of Prince President, actually. And He was able to, of course, win by evoking the Napoleonic legend with its memories of national glory. He promised to bring back those glory days, and he also made many promises to various groups. For example, he promised order and prosperity to the middle class. He promised farmers and the poor economic assistance, and the old, higher class, older nobility, the financial aristocracy. They were promised. They really swallow all of this glory and order and prosperity message. So he had no trouble getting himself elected, and Louis Napoleon will, of course, remain a important figure for many decades to come in France.
He promises to heal divisions, impose order, and restore France to her former glory.
The moderates feared the victory of the people more than that of the Bourbon troops, Francesco Crispi, Sicilian revolutionary. And there's the crux. The moderate middle classes feared the mob more than they feared the return of the monarchy and the troops under the monarchy.
In Italy, the tumult continues into 1849. In the Papal States, the reforms of Pope Pius had seen him held up as an unlikely liberal role model.
Pope Pius IX is one of the most important and influential popes in all of history. He has the longest confirmed reign as pope. His papacy lasted 32 years until his death in 1878, I believe. When he was elected pope, he saw that the Papal States was in dire need of reform, and he actually approved several liberal reforms, which is very unlikely coming from the papacy, which has traditionally been very conservative, of course. And he established a consultative chamber, he established a council of state, he approved a civic guard. He also liberalized press law to allow nationalist and liberal texts to be publicized. When the revolutions happened in Naples, he granted a constitution. Well, he was rather forced to grant a constitution. And he created a bicameral legislative chamber. He also appointed a liberal ministry. So Pope Pius really was unusually liberal for a pope. And despite all of this, he was not able to prevent a revolution in the Papal States.
But escalating radicalism and violence, notably the assassination of his justice minister, Pellegrino Rossi, caused Pope Pius to flee Rome. In his absence, a Roman Republic is declared.
We had many Roman republics. Even France established a sister republic called the Roman Republic. Of course, these are all aspiring to the legacy of the original, the one and only Roman Republic during ancient times. Of course, they were nothing like it.
It is led by Giuseppe Mazzini, the iconic figurehead of Italian nationalism, who's devoted his life to the unification of his homeland.
Another father of modern Italy, Mazzini, really was the spearhead of this Italian nationalist movement, what we sometimes call the Risorgimento. He was originally a poor man's lawyer who joined the same secret nationalist organization that Louis Napoleon did, the Carbonari. He went into exile because he was arrested for these activities. He founded an organization called Young Italy, which really was the first democratic and all-inclusive nationalist Italian organization there was. And he continued to spur for Italian unification by establishing more of these sorts of organizations. He also founded newspapers, published different works, wrote open letters to Italian monarchs, and yeah, right. Where he has had a mixed legacy, perhaps, but these days he is considered to have played an indispensable part in the making of modern Italy.
But elsewhere, the Italian cause fares badly. Carlo Alberto resumes his war with Austria, with disastrous consequences. At the Battle of Novara, Radetzky inflicts another heavy defeat. Carlo Alberto abdicates in favor of his son, Vittorio Emanuele, to avoid a republican revolution.
Vittorio Emanuele is the third founding father of Italy, alongside his prime minister, Count Cavour, who is the fourth one. Vittorio Emanuele is, of course, the first king of Italy, a united Italy. And it really was a watershed moment in history, because Italy hasn't been united since the days of the Western Roman Empire, really.
12 years later, he'll become the first king of a modern united Italy. In the south, Ferdinand reverts to absolutist rule and sends troops to Sicily who stamp out the revolution.
He also used his navy to bombard various Sicilian cities, and this earned him the nickname of King Bomba, if you can believe it. And in many cases, his navy continued shelling these revolutionaries, despite the fact that they had surrendered many and many hours earlier. So it was quite vindictive, one could imagine.
Then, to the dismay of liberals across Europe, French President Louis Napoleon sends troops to crush the Republic of Rome and put the Pope back on his throne. He has decided the support of French Catholics is more important to him than the fate of Italian republicans.
And this is really surprising, really, coming from Louis Napoleon, who had been fighting for the Italian nationalist cause since his younger days. But now Louis Napoleon is a politician, and he's got to do what is most politically expedient. And France is, of course, a Catholic majority country, and so this French military expedition to put the Pope back on his throne really was quite popular with French Catholics, but it infuriated French Republicans who supported the Roman Republic. Now, to please these radical Republicans, Louis Napoleon asked the Pope to introduce further liberal reforms and to adopt the Code Napoleon, the law code that Napoleon I had established. And to gain further support from the Catholics, he also approved several laws that restored the role of the Catholic Church in the French educational system. So Louis Napoleon is really trying to play all of these groups off of each other, and that's really what he's going to continue to do in the decades to come.
French forces are led by General Oudinot, son of the famous Marshal.
We'll talk about him soon.
Rome's defenders are led by Garibaldi. But despite skilled and courageous resistance, Rome is forced to surrender after a 2-month siege. That summer, Radetzky also retakes Venice and puts an end to its republic. In March, the German National Parliament in Frankfurt had finally agreed on a constitution for a united Germany. It is to be a constitutional monarchy under an emperor. The man intended to play this role is Frederick William of Prussia. So when he declines the offer, the plan is killed stone dead. In public, he says it is impossible without the consent of the other German princes. In private, he says he would never accept a crown from the gutter, disgraced by the stink of revolution.
Now, Frederick William's refusal of an imperial crown really ties back into his ideology, basically. He is a romanticist, and his romantic aspiration is really to establish the medieval Holy Roman Empire And with the smaller, semi-sovereign monarchies under the authority of an Habsburg emperor, he believes the Habsburg family is divinely ordained to rule over the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, Frederick William could only accept an imperial crown if he was elected by other German princes, such as had been the custom under the Holy Roman Empire, where you had several electorates that had the deciding vote in electing who would be the Holy Roman Empire. And that is reason, besides the fact that this crown is disgraced by the stink of revolution, that he rejects the offer of an imperial crown. Now, he's kind of going to contradict himself pretty much after this, because he notices that Austria is pretty ambivalent about Prussia taking a greater role in German affairs. So Frederick William begins considering the creation of a Prussian-led union. So all German states, excluding those of the Habsburgs, would be united under the Hohenzollern authority, and they would be linked in an overarching political framework. And he attempted to establish what is known to history as the Erfurt Union, which would be a union of German states without Austria. But he abandoned this idea pretty quickly in 1850 during an event called the Punctuation of Olmütz, where Austria particularly, and even Russia, really rejected the notion of an Erfurt Union. And so he sort of just gave up the plan. So we will not see the unification of Germany in 1849, but we will see it soon.
Revolts in support of the national constitution break out in Saxony, the Palatinate, and the Grand Duchy of Baden. They are crushed by local forces, assisted by Prussian troops. The Frankfurt Parliament itself is dissolved. What hope there had been for a united Germany under a liberal constitution lies in ruins. In Austria, the new Emperor Franz Joseph issues his own new constitution,
This is what I was talking
reclaiming
about.
almost all political power. He also revokes all the liberal reforms passed by the Hungarian parliament, known as the April Law.
Now, if we're going to be legal about this, technically this was not allowed by the constitutional framework of Austria, because according to the constitutional arrangement worked out with the Habsburg emperors, once a law was passed in the Hungarian parliament, it could not be revoked by the emperor. And also, even though Ferdinand has abdicated the Austrian throne, technically he could not, since the Kingdom of Hungary is a separate entity within a greater empire, he could not technically abdicate. The only way for the throne of Hungary to pass is if the emperor dies, or if the Hungarian parliament votes to depose and then elect a new emperor. This has not been the case. Ferdinand is technically still the king of Hungary. He's still alive, and he will actually survive until the 1870s. There's actually a photograph of him, you should look it up. He really looks like he does in the paintings. Anyways, so this action was technically illegal by Franz Joseph, but might makes right in this world.
In response, Lajos Kossuth declares formal Hungarian independence, and the country begins an extraordinary campaign of military mobilization. Hungarian commander General Gergely retakes Budapest. He then launches a bloody assault on Buda Castle, overpowering its Austrian garrison. In desperation, the Austrian Emperor travels to Warsaw to formally request military aid from the Emperor of Russia. Russian troops have already moved into Moldavia and then Wallachia to put down the Romanian liberal revolution.
Yeah, and Nicholas's willingness to intervene to put down these revolutionary and radical movements earned him the nickname Gendarme of Europe, the policeman of Europe. And it's a really an apt nickname, really, because this is what Nicholas does, and he's going to ensure that Austria survives and that the Austrian authority is restored over the entirety of the empire. This is also sort of why Austria sits out on the Crimean War in a few years, because Austria feels like it owes Russia a favor, and it sort of does.
Nicholas now agrees to send troops to Hungary to crush those he describes as the enemies of order and tranquility. Hungary faces an impossible strategic situation, surrounded and outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The combined onslaught is irresistible. The Hungarian forces are driven south and finally forced to surrender. In the aftermath, around 120 Hungarian politicians and army officers are executed. So ends Hungary's War of Independence.
Yes, and after this, Franz Josef will implement direct rule over Hungary, and there will basically be a military dictatorship in which Hungarian parliament and Hungarian nobles have really nothing to say. They have no influence at all. But Austria will become weaker in the years to come, and this will eventually force the Compromise of 1867, whereby the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary is created, and then through that, Hungarian independence or Hungarian autonomy within the empire is restored. But during the 18-year personal rule by Franz Josef, he really starts to go at it hard. He is implementing German as the official administrative language of Hungary, and he is really trying to integrate Hungary closer to Austria proper, like one of his predecessors, Franz Joseph II, had done. He also tried to integrate Hungary with moderate success. We have been beaten and humiliated. The fate of European democracy has slipped from our hands. Pierre Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon also, famous name.
1848 was a year like no other. A series of seismic political events following one upon another like falling dominoes. But what had been achieved? A British historian famously described 1848 as the turning point at which modern history failed to turn. And for all the euphoria of Europe's springtime of the peoples, by 1849, it seemed that the counter-revolutionaries had won everywhere. But some gains did endure, such as the abolition of serfdom in Austria and the popular vote in France.
Yeah, and the 1850 Constitution of Prussia. And Sardinia also retained its 1848 Constitution. Also in Austria, the seigneurial dues, seigneurial rights, the medieval customs of seniority were not restored. So, some things did come out of this revolution, but on the grand scale things, considering it all, it was not a whole lot, actually.
Though France became a little less democratic in 1852, after Louis Napoleon made himself emperor.
I have a lot to say on the reign of Napoleon III. I think he is he's been mocked and derided by the historians traditionally, and by people comparing him to Napoleon I. Napoleon III was not as incompetent as he's been made out to be. His modernizing reforms quite important in establishing modern-day France. And he also had some foreign policy success. Mainly, he helped Piedmont Piedmont-Sardinia fight against Austria in the 1860s. We'll take a look at the Battle of Solferino video one day. And yeah, otherwise his foreign policy is quite a disaster, and we can go into it at great length, but I won't do it here because this video is already very long. So one day we will return to talk about Napoleon III.
Across Europe, governments modernized and paid more attention to economic and social issues, partly in response to the new challenges that had emerged from socialist and working-class politics. The causes of German and Italian unification had been defeated, but made giant strides and learned crucial lessons. Their goals would not be achieved by ideas alone, but the realities of force. In the words of Bismarck, the great questions of the day were to be settled not through speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood.
The most famous quote from Bismarck, and really it is true when you look at history. And the Italian unification was achieved under the leadership of Vittorio Emanuele of Piedmont-Sardinia, a monarchy. The unification of Germany was achieved by Prussia, an absolute monarchy. And yeah, you need to back up your ideas with something, some form of leverage. Otherwise, there's going to be a counter-revolution, and it's going to be put down by force, most likely. And yeah, this, especially the unification of Italy under a monarchy, really was a devastating blow to people like Mazzini, who dreamed of a republican united Italy, not a monarchical Italy. And the German Empire, of course, was an absolute monarchy. And it was a blow to German liberals and Republicans who wanted to see more an ideal version of their Germany. Alas, it was not to be.
It would be wars waged by powerful monarchies that united Germany and Italy. The legacy of 1848, for good and ill, would be felt for decades to come.
Alright, we've reached the end of this video. 1848 revolutions are a fascinating moment in European history, and like I've said to some others before, this is a largely forgotten event in history, and it really shouldn't be, because it was instrumental in shaping the modern world that we know today. So with that, I'll leave you to your thoughts. If you have any context, any comments, leave them down below. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe for more. We are going to continue with Doherty's Unbiased History of Rome and the Napoleon's Marshals series. So we'll come back to that soon enough. But in any case, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later.